dear students, dear colleagues, and above all, dear Professor Benhabib. Good evening. I'm Ayşe Çağlar. I'm a permanent fellow at the Institute for Human Sciences, IWM, and a professor at the Department of Social and Cultural Anthropology, University of Vienna. I welcome you all in the name of the IWM and the University of Vienna to this year's IWM lectures. These lectures are organized by IWM in collaboration with the 4 departments of the University of Vienna, Department of Sociology, Department of Social and Cultural Anthropology, Philosophy, and Political Science. For those of you who are not yet very familiar with the Institute for Human Sciences from the university, it is an advanced study in humanities and social sciences established in 1982. And we are an advanced study, and we host more than 100 fellows, guests every year from very different parts of the world in various disciplines, but also these guests and fellows include journalists, not only the academics, but also journalists and translators. We aspire to promote exchange between academia and society. IWM lectures are a series of public talks which are launched in 2000 on the occasion of Hans-Georg Gadamer's 100th birthday, who has been a supporter of the Institute since its inception. The idea of those lectures are that internationally distinguished scholar is invited to deliver 3 lectures on a topic of his or her own choice, and usually we have a publication coming out of those lectures. And we had, since its inception, we had several very prominent scholars, starting from Charles Taylor, Paul Ricoeur, Richard Kapuscinski, Stefan Kotkin, Jan Werner Müller, Chakrabarty, and Dani Rodrik, Wolfgang Streeck. And this year, for these 3 IWM lectures, we are pleased and honored that Professor Seyla Benhabib had accepted our invitation to deliver these lectures. Tonight it will be the first lecture, and on 11th the second, and 19th the third lecture. Now I will give the floor to the head of the Department of Philosophy, Professor Karamanolis, to introduce Professor Seyla Benhabib. Professor Karamanolis is an historian of ancient philosophy. He worked on Aristotelianism, Platonism, and he had worked also on the history and the philosophy of early Christianity, but also on Cicero. So please, the floor is yours.
Hello. Well, dear colleagues, dear students, ladies and gentlemen, it's a great pleasure to welcome you all to the first lecture of Professor Benhabib. And it is a great honor for me to introduce her to you and to moderate the discussion afterwards. So Professor Benhabib is the Eugene Mayer Professor of Political Science and Philosophy, Emerita at Yale University. where she taught from 2001 to 2022. She's currently scholar in residence at Columbia Law School and professor adjunct of law, where she teaches legal and political theory, as well as a course on refugee, migration, and citizenship law in comparative perspective. She also holds appointments in Columbia University Center for Contemporary Critical Thought and the Department of Philosophy. She was the president of the Eastern Division of the American Philosophical Association 2006-2007, and has been a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences since 1995. From 1996 to 2000, she was director of Harvard University's program for degrees in social studies. And from 2002 to 2008, she directed Yale's program in ethics, politics, and economics. She has previously taught at the New School of Social Research and Harvard Universities and has held visiting professorships at Cambridge University, European University Institute, Tel Aviv University, University of Frankfurt, and the University of Amsterdam. Professor Benhabib is the recipient of a number of prizes and awards, of the Ernst Bloch Prize in 2009, the Leopold Lucas Prize in 2012, the Meister Eckhart Prize in 2014. She was a fellow at the Wissenschaftskolleg in Berlin in 2008-2009, as well as a Guggenheim Fellow in 2011-2012. In fall 2023, she will be Albert Hirschman Fellow at the Institute for the Human Sciences in Vienna. Professor Benhabib holds honorary degrees from the Universities of Utrecht, Valencia, Bougazici, Georgetown, Geneva, and the Université Catholique de Louvain. While she has written and co-edited over 15 books on critical theory, from Hegel to Habermas and to Hannah Arendt, on discourse ethics, on feminist theory and human rights, and her work has been translated into more than 12 languages. So I will mention some of them. Well, she's the author of Critique, Norm, and Utopia, a study of the foundations of critical theory, published in 1986, situating the self, gender, community, and postmodernism in contemporary ethics, published in 1992, The Claims of Cultural Equality and Diversity in the Global World, published in 2003, The Rights of Others, Aliens, Citizens, and Residents in 2004, and she is currently working on a book called At the Margins of the Modern State, Critical Theory and the Law, which is forthcoming with Polity Press, and she's also co-editing a volume with Ayelet Shahar called Lawless Zones, Rightless Subjects, Migration and Asylum in the Territorialized and Reterritorialized Border Regimes. So you see the span of her interests, and that she works on the intersection of critical theory, philosophy, sociology, and human rights. So it's a great pleasure to welcome her, and the floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, students and friends. It's a real pleasure to be, I should say, back in Vienna. It's not my first time, maybe my fourth or fifth visit to your beautiful city. I want to begin by expressing my deepest thanks to the Institut für die Wissenschaften vom Menschen, which I had first visited 25 years ago when Krzysztof Michalski, the first president and founder of the Institute, was still alive. In the meantime, the EVM has become one of the most important transatlantic and dare I say, cosmopolitan institutions of our world. Special thanks to Professor Ayşe Çağlar for her efforts in making my visit possible, and also thanks to the various university departments and also to Professor George Karamanolis for their hospitality, and particularly the philosophy department. I'm honored to be the Albert Hirschman Fellow at the EVM, and I will begin this evening's lecture with a brief honoring of Albert Hirschman, whom I don't know if at least the younger generation is familiar with him. It's a rare coincidence that in honoring the one in whose name a lecture series is presented, the lecturer has had a rare encounter with the work of the honoree as well. In my case, this occurred a decade ago when I was asked to review the truly remarkable biography of Albert Hirschman by Jeremy Edelman, called The Odyssey of Albert O. Hirschman. Being a scholar of the Frankfurt School, Hannah Arendt, Judith Shklar, and Jürgen Habermas, I considered myself knowledgeable in 20th century German émigré thought and its legacy, but I was pleasantly surprised and almost stunned to learn about Albert Hirschman's life and politics. Together with Varian Fry, the American diplomat who had come to Europe on behalf of the Emergency Rescue Committee with the purpose of saving as many luminaries from the clutches of fascism as he could, Hirschman prepared the exit visas for Hannah Arendt and Walter Benjamin and many others, enabling them to cross the border between France and Franco's Spain. Though Walter Benjamin took his own life in Portbou on September 26, 1940, in a moment of despair, many others owe their survival to Hirschman's and Fry's ingenuity and courage. There is also a Netflix movie now on this that I could not remember the title of. I didn't think it was very good, but nonetheless that. This was not Hirschman's sole legacy. He was a witness to the tragic history of European left defeats and also to the birth of a manifesto of hope that would only be realized in an as yet unimaginable future. From July to October 1936, Hirschman fought in Barcelona with the Spanish anarchist and independent left movements before Stalin destroyed them with the help of Franco's and Hitler's fascism. Adelman notes that this is one episode about which Albert Hirschman never wanted to talk. The young Hirschman was also present at the inception of the Ventetone Manifesto, one of the first articulations of a trans-European cosmopolitan political and economic project written by the Italian socialist liberal theorists Eugenio Colorni, Altiero Spinelli, and Ernesto Rossi. The manifesto had been smuggled out of the prison on the island by Rossi's wife. The manifesto called for a free and united Europe. A draft manifesto soon became the official statement of the European federalist movement. Hirschman, who had seen the collapse of the independent left in Europe, could not have known that he was also at the present at the creation of an alternative future, which would only be realized half a century later. Although Hirschman left Europe, a few more remarks on him, for the United States, his European past did not leave him. Trying for various governmental positions in post-war United States, which was slowly descending into the anti-communist madness of the Cold War, he failed to get clearance of security clearance by the Treasury Department and had to leave the United States with his young family for Colombia. It is through this encounter with a non-European and non-Anglo-Saxon world that some of Hirschman's enduring categories to the social sciences of the 20th century emerged. I do not mean only the famous exit, voice, and loyalty triad, but rather an alternative vision of economic development and social progress, which I will explore in particular in the final part of these lectures. Hirschman was one of the first to criticize the identification of economic development with Western-style, industrial and export-based economic growth. He thus opened a way for linking ecological concerns with economic development. In that sense, in many others, his work connects the themes which are going to be at the center of my lectures as well. My central question in these lectures is, how can we rethink cosmopolitanism in today's world, together with a concern for justice in the global south and planetary sustainability? I begin today's lecture in a more philosophical mode by considering cosmopolitanism in the light of multiple contemporary criticisms it has faced. In the second lecture next week, I will address the imbrications or entanglements of cosmopolitanism with capitalist modernity and imperialism, and I will defend a reconstruction of aspects of international law in the light of the contributions of third world scholars. And in the final lecture, I will turn to the emerging planetary perspective in the human and social sciences and distinguish between the dimensions of world, earth, and planet as the many different elements of the globe which need to be taken into account. So, let me begin. Cosmopolitanism reconsidered. The intense interest in cosmopolitanism in the social and political sciences, cultural and legal studies dates back to the last 2 decades of the 20th century. With the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989, the unification of Germany, and the extension of the European Union to East European and Central European countries, formerly under communist rule, the Kantian cosmopolitan ideal of uniting diverse countries under the rule of law, respect for human rights, and the movement of people's goods and services across borders, as it's stated in the mission of the European Common Market, seemed to come alive. During the same period, thinkers who looked upon the Eurocentrism of this cosmopolitan revival with some skepticism defended an alternative they named cosmopolitics. As Peng Chia, professor of comparative politics at Berkeley University, writes, studies of various global phenomena such as transcultural encounters, mass migration and population transfers between East and West, first and third worlds, North and South, the rise of global financial and business networks, the formation of transnational advocacy networks, and the proliferation of transnational human rights instruments seemed to embody a different form of non-ethnocentric cosmopolitanism, end of quote. Yet the upshot of these transcultural encounters, mass migrations, and the formation of diasporas, all being sucked now into the financial and communicational vortex created by globalization, resulted neither in perpetual peace, as Kant would have wished, nor in non-ethnocentric cosmopolitanism, as Chia and other critics had hoped for. Rather, the conflict between religions, cultures, and public institutions arising from these encounters first became visible with the September 11, 2001 attacks on the World Trade Center in New York and the subsequent global rise of Islamicist movements. Cultural and religious fundamentalisms of many other kinds, extending from Hindu revivalism to the ethnocentric chauvinism of hegemonic superpowers, the United States, Russia, and China were soon to follow. Focusing on struggles around the meaning of secularism, the wearing of the hijab by Muslim girls and women, increasing multicultural demands on the secular state, and Europe's unending refugee crisis, so-called refugee crisis, Etienne Balibar observed, quote, that contemporary cosmopolitics is a particularly ambiguous form of politics. It consists exclusively of conflicts between universalities without ready-made solutions, end of quote. By the beginning of the new century, cosmopolitanism and cosmopolitics had fallen on hard times. As the optimism about the spread of international human rights law waned in the wake of the endless wars against terror and humanitarian interventions, as the many crises of the European Union led to the disillusionment with the European project, and democratization in Eastern and Central Europe stalled, the exit of United Kingdom from the European Union in January 2020 seemed to put the nail in the coffin of cosmopolitan dreams. A slow and persistent rise of authoritarianism, not only in Hungary, Poland, and Russia, but also in Turkey, India, and the United States unfolded. And with Russia's attack on Ukraine in spring 2022, the clouds of war have once more darkened the European horizon. For authoritarian populist movements, cosmopolitanism has become the arch-enemy. In their eyes, cosmopolitan elites ally themselves with the defense of international law, global human rights, and refugee NGOs. They disregard their nation's histories and the injustices they suffered, pleading instead for open or at least porous borders. Cosmopolitans, they argue, are indifferent to the sullying of national cultures by alien values and mores, celebrating instead cultural creolization and fragmentation. Major thinkers who had defended cosmopolitanism now, in view of these developments, now have bid farewell to it. Etienne Balibar again believes that contemporary cosmopolitics does not prefigure the realization of a philosophical cosmopolitanism, but he leaves open the possibility that it does not do away with taking it as a point of departure. There's a subtle point which I'm going to try to elaborate. In what sense is contemporary cosmopolitics going to go, or could it go back to the philosophical tradition of cosmopolitanism from the ancient Greeks to Kant? Emily Apter, a professor again of literature at New York University, summarizes these misgivings about cosmopolitanism as follows. She writes, "The cultural model of cosmopolitanism was equally obsolete, resting as it did on a detachment theory of the subject divested of the primordial claims of ontological nationalism, as well as on a pre-comprehended notion of the human and the cultivation of the old humanisms within the disciplinary humanities," end of quote. Whereas in the French context, to which both Balibar and Emily Apter are indebted, the critique of cosmopolitan humanism owed much to the work of Michel Foucault and Jacques Derrida. Martha Nussbaum, one of the early defenders of cosmopolitanism in the English-speaking world, in her recent work has named the cosmopolitan tradition a noble but flawed ideal. I want to situate cosmopolitanism as it has gotten caught in the crossfire of these contemporary battles in culture, politics, and the law, and argue against what I will call a drift toward liberal nationalism among major thinkers. Then I want to ask what remains of Kantian cosmopolitanism in the light not only of these critics, but also of postcolonial criticisms. But before proceeding, let me just say, and I won't be able to develop all the philosophical premises that I'm working with in this lecture, that for me, cosmopolitanism has three distinct dimensions. First, it's a moral philosophy that espouses the equal dignity and worth of all human beings across borders, nations, and communities. Second, it is a meta-theoretical position which views cultures as interacting with one another throughout human history and borrowing and learning from one another, a topic most aptly written about by Anthony Appiah in various works. Third, cosmopolitanism has a legal dimension in that it defends that each human being is entitled to certain universal human rights. Cosmopolitans consider that human beings are entitled to such rights as are increasingly codified in the various international human rights treaties since World War II. Each of these premises requires independent clarification, and this is a task in which I have engaged in previous works, but I will return to some questions of moral philosophy in particular at the end of my lectures, and then take up international law and human rights in the second lecture. So let me begin with Nussbaum. Now, I'm going to engage in a careful reading of Martha Nussbaum's work, not only because I have the greatest respect for her work, also because I think Nussbaum's departure from cosmopolitanism towards what I call liberal nationalism is indicative of a certain element in the zeitgeist. In her book published in 2019, called The Cosmopolitan Tradition, a Noble but Flawed Ideal, Nussbaum begins with a masterful reconstruction of the philosophical ethics of cosmopolitanism among both the Stoic and Cynic thinkers in the Roman and Greek traditions. She argues that, taken by itself, this vision need not involve politics. It is a moral ideal. In the thought of many of the tradition's exemplars, however, the idea of equal human dignity does ground a distinctive set of obligations for international and national politics. The idea of respect for humanity has been at the root of much of the international human rights movement, and it has played a formative role in many national and legal and constitutional traditions, end of quote. Now, Nussbaum then traces the evolution of cosmopolitan ideals from Cicero to Grotius to Adam Smith, assuming that there is not much that is distinctive in Kantian cosmopolitanism from these other positions. But my disagreement with her is not in her historical reconstruction of the cosmopolitan tradition, which is masterful in part. Rather, it is with the continuing emphasis on the place of the nation, and in particular, her dismissiveness towards international law. I see an evolution in Nussbaum's position from cosmopolitanism to patriotism and to what I will call liberal nationalism. According to Nussbaum, national sovereignty is being eroded in the contemporary world. It is even being leached away, a striking phrase in English, not only by multinational private institutions, with which many of us may be inclined to agree, but also by NGOs, and in favor of an international realm that is not decently accountable to people in each nation through their own political choices and self-given laws. Now, there is not really further elaboration or even distinguishing here between multinational corporations in the economic sphere, NGOs, and other aspects of international law. Nussbaum now argues nations are vehicles for human autonomy and the accountability of law to people. I want to characterize this position as liberal nationalism. And I will be discussing liberal nationalism also in my second lecture. And the first premise of liberal nationalism is that without well-protected borders, there can be no democratic self-governance. There must be a centralized agent of some kind, argued the liberal nationalist, that takes responsibility for protecting a country's national, natural, and material assets, and that ensures continuity of its public culture and democratic values. Immigration and transnational movements across borders are permitted, but the regulation of their quantity and quality remains sovereign privileges. Countries may admit more or less numbers of refugees and respect the claims of asylum seekers. They have the right to regulate access to their labor markets and to turn away certain kinds of strangers. Okay? Although it is desirable that legislatures should act in accordance with international law, for liberal nationalists, what counts in the first place is our law, our precedents, and our values. Now, this is a formidable position in contemporary, in particular, Anglo-American political thought, and adherents include, among others, the late John Rawls in his work, The Law of Peoples, Michael Walzer throughout his life, from Spheres of Justice onwards, Thomas Nagel in his recent writings on international justice, and David Miller, who most explicitly wrote the book on liberal nationalism. Now, the puzzling thing to me about Martha Nussbaum's work is that she characterizes her own position as global political liberalism. And I don't think it is. And in particular, where these contradictions, I think, in her theory become particularly evident are in her reflections on the status of women and global feminism. First, Nussbaum says international law is weak and inefficacious. There's a critique with which we've been familiar since Hobbes and Austen in the legal positivist tradition. She further maintains that the role of international agreements is moral and expressive rather than legal. International law does not and probably should not change domestic law directly. Now, this is a very subtle and important point, which I'm happy to elaborate in the discussion, and it's not just a point for lawyers, it's of philosophical interest, it's of general interest, namely, how does really international law impact and affect domestic domestic law. Noting now that there may be conflicts between her earlier defense of women's global human rights and these rather brief dismissals of the role of international law in bringing about the kind of global political liberalism that she espouses, Nussbaum writes, I don't believe I have this, CEDAW, Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, right? CEDAW accomplished little directly. It is also a deeply flawed document, skirting around some of the most important issues, such as access to artificial contraception and counting women's work in national income courts. This may be so, but surely working towards a global political liberalism will require both the cultivation of transnational women's movements and the revision of human rights documents. CEDAW has been criticized by third world feminists for prioritizing the careerist development of first world women, who focus on workplace anti-discrimination and anti-harassment issues to the detriment of the social and economic rights of women, such as health, childcare, and most importantly, women's poverty. Nussbaum shares this critique, but why then does she dismiss the significance of transnational human rights law in giving voice to and facilitating transformation towards a more cosmopolitan vision of human dignity across borders? We seem to have come full circle then. The historical disillusionment with the tragedies of nationalism after 2 world wars, the Holocaust of European Jews and genocides committed in non-European parts of the world, which gave rise to cosmopolitanism again in the post-1945 world, with the establishment of the United Nations and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, has now been replaced not only by a growing skepticism towards the ideal of cosmopolitanism, but to the abandonment of Kantian ideals of a federation of nations united around respect for what Kant called international, as well as cosmopolitan law, Völkerrecht und kosmopolitisches Recht. How do we move beyond this regressive re-idealization of the nation-state? Let us look back to the tradition of ancient ethics, very briefly, forgive me, within which cosmopolitanism originates, as well as to its Kantian transformation. Cosmopolitanism is a contested legacy. Whether one describes Socrates as the first cosmopolites, citizen of the world, or reserves the term for the cynic Diogenes Laertius, or Marcus Tullius Cicero, or Marcus Aurelius, the Roman emperor. Cosmopolitanism begins with a critique of the polis and the civitas in the name of the cosmos, of an ordered reality whose rationality transcends the many and conflicting and often unjust nomoi, laws and customs of the political world. The cosmopolitan critique can take the form of a withdrawal from active engagement in politics, as it did with the cynic Diogenes, or with the Stoic Cicero. Or it can lead to the development of a more universalistic ethics, whose main dictum is not to commit wrong against any human being. Just actions then are not limited to our treatment of others in one's tribe, in one's city, or religion. Ancient Greek and Roman cosmopolitanisms eventually lead to a universalism, and in particular the rejection of the practices of slavery, and find eventual expression in early Christianity. In reformulating cosmopolitanism with the phrase Weltbürgerschaft, Immanuel Kant took the cosmopolitan tradition to a wholly new level. Cosmopolitanism was no longer just an individual moral or cultural attitude. It could lead to a reform of institutions in changing a new world. Let me remind you here now of Kant's essay, Zum ewigen Frieden. Yeah? Kant begins this famous essay of 1795, concluded at the end of the revolutionary wars between France and Prussia, with a well-known joke. And you know, there aren't that many jokes in the history of philosophy, but maybe you're familiar with this. We can leave open the question whether this satirical caption to the picture of a graveyard, Zum ewigen Frieden, eternal peace, right? Which was painted on the sign of a Dutch innkeeper, applies to human beings in general, or specifically to the heads of states, who can never get enough of war, or even just to philosophers who dream the sweet dream of perpetual peace. Of course, Kant is ironizing himself. I mean, Zum ewigen Frieden is what you put on, you know, you understand, right? Whether it is human beings or leaders or states, or maybe even philosophers who dream the sweet dream of eternal or perpetual peace, it's irrelevant, says Kant. The point is that one can enjoy the sweet dream not in life, but only in death. But of course, Kant, who proposes preliminary and definitive articles of peace among states, is himself aware of the irony that accompanies his philosophical proposal, which he then calls an Entwurf, a project. Yet he is not deterred from trying to make perpetual peace among nations possible. So the first definitive article of perpetual peace states, "The civil constitution of every state shall be republican." The second definitive article of perpetual peace requires that international right, Völkerrecht, shall be based on the federalism of free states. Now, the distinctiveness of this kind of federalism is that it is a pacific federation. Kant calls this foedus pacificum. This federation would be distinct from a peace treaty, what he calls a pactum pacis, in that it seeks, I'm quoting Kant, to end not merely one war, as does the latter, that is, a peace treaty ends a war, but this federation is a federation to end all wars. End of quote. There's been a wide-ranging discussion in the philosophical literature as to whether such a federation of states means a Weltstaat or a Weltrepublik, a world state or a world republic. Kant rejected the idea of a world state, which he called a soulless despotism. Postcolonial critics also point out that it is questionable whether Kant thought that all peoples of the world would be capable of forming a republican constitution. Also left unanswered by these formulations is whether empires such as the Ottoman Empire of Kant's time, for example, would be considered a party to such a Pacific federation. It was not until the Berlin Entente of 1885 that the Ottomans were actually invited to the table. In other words, does international law forbidding wars presuppose a specific state form alone, and can this state form be universalized? Must all states falling under international law be republican in form? In my second lecture, I will discuss in more depth the doctrine of liberal internationalism, whose beginnings go back to Kant as distinguished from liberal nationalism. Now, in the third and definitive article of Perpetual Peace, this is the one that raises most difficult questions concerning Kantian cosmopolitanism and the imperialism of 18th century European powers. This is also the only article that Kant calls ein kosmopolitisches Recht, which in English, of course, means right and law and is always confounding to English or speaking students reading Kant and Hegel for the first time. And Kant writes, cosmopolitan rights shall be limited to the conditions of universal hospitality. And he uses the French word hospitalité in this context. Now, Kant emphasizes that this is not philanthropy, okay, but a matter of right. Okay, so cosmopolitanism is not a moral virtue of showing Gastgeberschaft. It is a right, he says. Quote, it means the right of a stranger not to be treated in a hostile manner by another upon his arrival on the other's territory, if this can be done without causing his death. He uses the word Untergang here. If it can be done without causing his death, the stranger can be turned away. This article applies to persons insofar as they are viewed as world citizens, meeting and interacting with one another at the borders of their polities and in a global sphere of commerce and trade, science and exploration, and more problematically also religious evangelizing. Kant is clear that kosmopolitisches Recht is a domain distinct from state law, Staatsrecht, as well as international law, Völkerrecht. But what is it then? And since there is no world state, can cosmopolitan right really be a source of law and right, as the ambiguities of the German term Recht suggest? Furthermore, while we can see in this article, if you wish, an early formulation of a right to asylum, right? The right of a stranger not to be treated in a hostile manner by another upon his arrival on the other's territory, and not to turn him away if this would imply his death, right? Kant is clear. Well, there is this kernel of the Asylrecht, but Kant is also here that this is a right of visitation, ein Besuchsrecht, and not a right of residency, not a Bleiberecht. Right? And the German is here interesting. He says, in order to have the right of residency on the territory of another, one needs ein wohlwollender Vertrag. That's to say, the sovereign must extend. In English, it's translated as a charitable contract. Wohlwollender, I don't know if charitable is a good translation, but a goodwilling, or let's say a contract and an offer in goodwill, okay? But Kant also insists that, quote, in virtue of the right to common possession of the surface of the earth, right? Which is not further explicated in this essay, every human being, in virtue of this right to the common possession of the surface of the earth, can present herself to the land of another and seek access, Zugang, but is not entitled to Eingang. Again, Kant is making a number of important distinctions here. Zugang means you have the right to travel and go to the shore of another and offer your greetings, so to speak. But you do not have the right to enter if the other does not want you to enter. But if you ask for asylum, the other has a right not to turn you away, in case turning you away would mean your Untergang, okay? Very, very complicated. Now, in the last decades, every aspect of this Kantian legacy has been subject to criticism. First, and this started, the dualistic ontological hierarchy of Kantian normative philosophy has been rejected based on reason versus the body, the Wille versus the appetites, Willkür, Nomoi versus Phusis, etc. It has been argued that in the evolution of Western thought, these hierarchies, which have defined the rational human being as such, have also led to the characterization of the non-male, non-European, non-white, and non-Christian others encountered through colonialism, imperialism, and Western domination as less than human. The cosmopolitan tradition, it is said, which was a critique of the practice of slavery among Greek city-states, when confronted with non-European and non-Christian others in the age of empires, produced equivocations and confusions. I'm putting this hypothetically because I will both agree and disagree with this position in my second lecture. I call it a hermeneutics of suspicion, and it's not that easy. Critics have further objected that Kant had not really extended, as I mentioned, the Republican Constitution to the colonies of Europe. His critique of European imperialism was equivocal, critics say, permitting access to foreign territories. But Zugang, access, some point out, would suffice to establish the kind of trading colonies that Western empires, such as the British and the Dutch, wanted to form in China and Japan in particular. James Tully is also critical of Kant's idea of hospitality, seeing in it not only a thinly veiled attempt at imperialist domination of other lands by establishing trading colonies, but also an excuse for Christian proselytizing and conversion of natives to Christianity. Certainly, the post-colonial critics are right that today we cannot write the history of global modernity as the emergence of Western modernity alone. As I will further discuss in the next lectures, we need to take into account the remapping of the world, that the conquest of the Americas, the drive to open China and Japan to Western trade, and what the scramble for Africa have meant for the cosmopolitan project. But Kant's views on imperialism are often misunderstood. He explicitly criticized European imperialism on the Sugar Islands, Cuba and the Caribbean islands, again making one of his few dour jokes in Perpetual Peace, saying that the imperialists discovered that it was better to get the natives to work rather than to kill them or to eat them. Yeah? So he explicitly criticizes European imperialism in the Sugar Islands and denounces attempts to forcibly open Japan and China to European trade. Yeah? So Europeans can go to China and Japan and seek contact. But if they don't want such contact, they just have to accept it, provided that the Europeans' death is not involved. There is also an evolution in Kant's thoughts concerning race, from a belief in the immutability of the races and the separation of human beings into categories in 1784, Universal History from a Cosmopolitan Point of View, to a more universalist attitude in Perpetual Peace and his later Metaphysik der Sitten. Given this confused legacy of cosmopolitanism in the encounter with Europe's others, defenders of cosmopolitics argued that the Kantian legacy must be rejected tout court, and a different philosophical foundation must be found. So the cosmopolitan project thus gets tangled up with the crises of foundationalist philosophy and the rejection of dualism ontologies. But we must not confuse genesis and validity, and simply rest satisfied with exercising what Paul Ricoeur has brilliantly called a hermeneutic suspicion. What would make the Cosmopolitan project, whether in its Kantian version of perpetual peace or in its more pluralist, postmodernist form as cosmopolitics, impossible, as well as incoherent, is abandoning the task of philosophical justification altogether. So let me conclude here very briefly by repeating principles of a communicative ethics that defends justification, Rechtfertigung, without foundationalism, without Begründung, and this is something I've developed in my book, Cosmopolitanismus ohne Illusionen, of 2016. So I just want to give you a little bit more of this philosophical background, but I apologize that it's coming at the end. So in various works in the past, I have outlined a cosmopolitanism without illusions, which rejects foundationalism but not the search for justification through reason-giving in dialogic processes of communicative ethics. Put succinctly, we need principles and ideals to sustain cosmopolitanism. Communicative reason and communicative ethics, as developed by Jürgen Habermas, and which I have tried to articulate further in my work, is not based on ontological hierarchy of reason versus the body, emotion versus the intellect. From the standpoint of a communicative ethics, every being capable of communication is one to whom I must offer a justification if our actions and interactions are to be limited by rules in a world of practices and institutions. And this is the neo-Kantian core of this ethics, in that the freedom of the action of one is limited by the action of another under a law of freedom. Now, I want to acknowledge the difficult philosophical question which has raised against communicative ethics again and again, whether this emphasis on communication is not a form of linguistic rationalism, in that it excludes those who cannot speak or articulate themselves from the circle of those to whom we owe moral justification. Though some have voiced this criticism of communicative ethics, communication need not be restricted to language alone. I would argue that the body and material embodiment in general, including that of animals and plants, are ciphers of communication, a view, again, that is increasingly pined with the planetary turn. I've defended an embodied rationality, according to which every human being is a concrete other with an individual affectivity, memory, and bodily presence. In the pragmatics of communication, facial gestures, as well as verbal intonations and bodily movements, are aspects of communication. In that sense, I do not see offering reasons to one another, Gründe nennen, as engaging in rationalist acts, but rather as an attempt to reach mutual understanding, Verständigung. Such dialogic practices can often be contentious, and there are moments when communication breaks down. What distinguishes communicative ethics from a dismissal of the standpoint of the other, or simply accepting the breakdown of communication, is the commitment to the ideals of equality and mutual respect, as hard as these have become in our times. Contemporary criticisms of Kantian cosmopolitanism show us how challenging such processes of communication have indeed become in a world in which relations of power and domination, as well as huge inequalities among individuals, nations, and groups, prevail. But we must not give up on the project of mutual understanding in a cosmos which has shrunk and which has come together far beyond the imagination of any 18th century thinker. Aspects of Kantian principles of perpetual peace have become embedded in worldwide institutions with the establishment of the United Nations and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, whose 75th anniversary we're celebrating this year. All this cannot be thrown into the trash bin of history, as many populists on the right and the left are inclined to do so. In my next lecture, I will begin by considering an essay of Sylvia Wynter, a Jamaican novelist, dramatist, and philosopher whose work combines Latin American, Caribbean, and Spanish histories, and who pushes the Cosmopolitan project towards a transnational perspective. I will then turn to the work of a group of scholars named Third World Approaches to International Law. On the basis of their contributions, I will criticize what I have described as liberal nationalism, and I will distinguish between liberal nationalism, liberal internationalism, neoliberal globalism, and cosmopolitanism. My thesis is that there have been significant developments in moving international law away from a Eurocentric and state-centered perspective towards a more cosmopolitan dimension, very much along the lines envisaged by Kant in his distinction between Völkerrecht and Kosmopolitisches Recht. These contributions, I will argue, can form the basis for a different, another cosmopolitanism in our age. And thank you all for listening.
Thank you very much indeed for this wonderful lecture. Well, it's my role to open the discussion and moderate the discussion, a very pleasant role. So, all kinds of contributions, questions, remarks, objections are very welcome.
Hello.
Hi, could you get up?
Sure. Yeah. This is like not quite as well thought out because I'm going first, but I wanted to, well, first of all, thank you so much. That was incredible. And I wanted to ask about what you were getting to towards the end around communication and the broadening of this definition to be between different types of entities. And I wanted to know more, or to ask whether the medium of communication or like container of communication, medium of communication is something that you think about in that definition, which is coming from also thinking about the sort of parallel rise and fall of hope and dismay around digital technologies as a universalizing and globalizing and cosmopolitan maybe hope that then, has now clearly showed itself not to really deliver on that. Thanks.
Thanks. That's a really great question. Let me take the first part. I was a bit hesitant to tag on that argument at the very end because it raises such complicated issues, but I figured, okay, I've done a number of books on that. And the first thing to be said about, the project of, communicative ethics is that it seems to assume, again, a conception of the subject as, if I tell my students sometimes, is a talking head. Okay? We're not talking heads. We are embodied beings, and there you will see some of my early work on feminist ethics coming to the fore, that namely, you know, we talk with our hands, we talk with our face, we talk with our bodies, we talk with our, you know, our voice is embodied. So it's extremely important to see the person as a whole behind the emphasis on communication, which in the sort of critical theory tradition out of which I come, had been on speech and its presuppositions, which are extremely, extremely important. But one thing that I have been learning, and I think you picked up on this through reading some of the newer literature on ecological crisis and what is being called now the circle of life and so on, is to understand what used to be called dead matter, dead nature, also in communicative terms. I mean, without getting, you know, too mystical or too fanciful about it, I think if we are going to take a conception of embodied subjectivity seriously, we also have to see that our bodies are in permanent exchange with our environment. And I think so. This is a new emphasis, something I'm trying to work out a little bit in my new work. Now, I have to say. You're quite right in bringing up the technology of communication, and I mean, it's often been pointed out that people fight more over the internet about certain things, that it leads to polarization. There is a lot of sociological work, and I'm sure some of you here are social scientists. There's a lot of sociological work showing that somehow this medium, although it connects us, it has also increased polarization. And there aren't very good explanations that I have seen as to why this happens. I once participated in a group discussion about 5 years ago in a chat discussion on abortion. The right of the fetus, this, etc., with other, philosophers, etc. We started fighting after about 3 sets of exchanges, and, I left the conversation. And I've had experiences in chat groups on specific subjects like this. Why does this happen? I am not sure, but one hypothesis that I have is that actually, with a physical person, I mean, there's always, of course, the danger of violence if communication, sort of breaks down. But there is something at stake, and it seems as if in these abstract, disembodied media, there is nothing at stake except you go on increasing. I'm not sure. I'm trying to, sort of think about this as well, and is there an ethics there? There should be, but all we know is like censoring this, censoring that, etc. Yeah. Okay.
Hello, thank you again for this very insightful lecture. As someone who grew up in Germany, I feel like there is this for me at least, very difficult to understand a general idealization of Kant that doesn't allow any form of criticism, because at the end of the day, what his philosophy is known for is just so formidable that there is a certain fear that if you start poking at the not so pretty parts, everything might fall apart. And my criticism, I guess, is of your criticism of the criticism of Kant, in a sense of not really giving credit to the people who have been historically marginalized from his ideology and who have actually, in reality, have had to fight on their own to to be recognized as full human beings, as people of the global South, women. So, in my thinking, is that those people, the critics, are actually the ones who are making Kant's philosophy, are pushing his philosophy actually much further than what he is doing. So I just wanted to know, in what way do you recognize the work of the people who have been cut out from Kant's philosophy and their actual contribution in making cosmopolitanism a real thing?
Yeah, I was having a little bit of acoustic difficulty, but if your question is to what an extent am I also appreciating the criticism of those who have raised their own voices against Kant, very much so. I mean, I have not named names apart from James Tully, but a lot of my reading, and I don't know if these names would be familiar to you, Inez Valdez, Walter Mignolo, maybe also to some extent Ayşe member. You know, so I don't know if you thought that I was not engaging with these thinkers. I am. But I'm going back and forth. I'm trying to use the old-fashioned word, I'm trying to be dialectical. I mean, let me try to make this argument explicit, okay? I think the two definitive articles of perpetual peace are principles of any international structure of nations. I believe that. The Republican Constitution is the form that is most compatible with human morality and freedom. That's a difficult argument to make, and I would have to justify it. But that's what Kant thought, and I think that he was correct. I think the Republican Constitution that's based on the separation of powers is the only one that is compatible with a universalist respect for the person. I'd make that argument. Then, the second principle of definitive principle of peace, that the right of the sovereign right to go to war must be restricted only to cases of self-defense, and that the heart of international law must be the regulation of war and peace. We fail in that. We fail in that miserably, okay? But I mean, in philosophy, we always have to distinguish. We have to distinguish between the fact and the justification. I mean, this is why I'm still a Kantian. Quaestio juris. What is the justification? Yeah? I mean, we know that the world is full of violence, domination, oppression, misery, and we have to try to understand it as well. But we can't, just point to that. If we are thinking critically, and I think that cosmopolitans were critics of their own times, eccentric critics of their own times, we have to formulate these principles. So, have I understood you correctly? I'm sorry, I was having a bit difficulty. But go ahead and tell me if I haven't.
No, not really. And I guess maybe you said that in the next lecture you're going to go more into postcolonial criticism of Kant. But my issue, and I don't think it's just something that I heard in this lecture, it's just something I've encountered every time I meet people who try to defend Kant, is that they are unwilling to realize that the people who he has shut out in his philosophy are actually the ones who are realizing his philosophy. Because they have had to fight for the rights, for the recognition of the dignity of their lives that he did not see for them. And therefore, I feel like the people who have been criticizing him historically, that criticism is very important, and it shouldn't be downplayed. And I just don't think that the criticism of the criticism is doing what it thinks it's doing.
I agree with part of what you said, but maybe it would be a longer contribution to understand, what mean more specifically criticism of the criticism. Look, there is no, as a counsel, there is no question in my mind that he changed his mind. But there are a lot of issues on which he did not change his mind. His remarks on women are deplorable. His remarks about the Jewish people are not very good either. There are a lot of places in his writings where, your hair stands on end a little bit, right? So we have to have the courage of criticism. In all respects, that much we owe him, I think.
Yeah, thank you very much. It was thank you for the lecture, and I'm very much looking forward to the next two ones. And maybe this is an unfair question, because I think you mentioned that you will go into this later in the two other ones. But I didn't quite understand. You said that that we could sort of abandon the idea of foundationalism in regards to cosmopolitanism, like philosophical cosmopolitanism, but at the same time not abandon the quest for justification. And in the Kantian picture, the justification would I guess, be transcendental, if I remember correctly, the order of Kant's works. So I had, I think, trouble understanding what would the justification be if it's not in some way also foundationalist.
Excellent, difficult philosophical question. I distinguish between Begründung und Rechtfertigung. And I think I have to stay within the domain of practical philosophy, praktische Philosophie, right? So I think that if you grant me that limitation, I am going to I'm trying to restrict justification to the possibility, okay, of mutually rationally acceptable reasons. Right? So there is, of course, a lot of work that needs to be done, maybe about exactly what mutuality means, but I am keeping my eye on the question of coexistence in the world. Remember now, in the case of praktische Philosophie, we have to proceed from the assumption of individuals acting and interacting in a world which is different than the standpoint of theoretical philosophy. So if we begin from the standpoint of praktische Philosophie and about the question that, all of the laws of freedom that Kant develops, whether in morality or in legal philosophy, is about limiting the action of one as compatible with the freedom of the other, right? The freedom of one as compatible with the freedom of the other under a mutually acceptable law. So that's where I would try to stay with justification.
Thank you as well for the lecture. Since you are coming from critical theory, I had maybe the naive question of to what extent you are including like the material conditions to the concept of cosmopolitanism, since also as a definition for the subject to communicate, there's still the question open of like what are the kind of like criteria for understanding each other, and they're like obviously highly influential underlying power structures still present. Like, how can you guarantee, maybe that's the bigger question than if you have this idea of cosmopolitanism, that it like doesn't sway over all those problematic structures that are still there and like lead to a hegemonial view on or like still keep this hegemonial view of a subject alive.
I think that one of the issues you suggested is the question of power, and I realize, of course, that when one, sort of presents this program of principles of communicative ethics, it seems as if the question of power is occluded, and you're absolutely right in raising this issue. But again, I want to go back and say that power requires justification. Okay? Power that does not justify itself borders on force and violence. It's a distinction that Hannah Arendt teaches us between power, force, and violence. Power is often based on ideology, obfuscation, form of belief. Right? But behind every structure of power, there is some kind of a structure of justification. Violence does not need to justify. It treats the other as an entity, right? And so you're quite right to raise the question about the relationship between a communicative ethics and power, but what I'd like to emphasize is the necessity to see power itself not as mute, not as silent, okay? We let someone exercise power over us in an institution, right? Your professor, your parent, your priest, your hodja, or rabbi. If this person exercises quote-unquote power over you, it's also because there is a structure of belief that legitimizes that. Now, the question of something like communicative ethics or principles of Rechtfertigung, justification, come at the point at which you start questioning the validity of that justification. Yeah? Let me mention something here. This is going to take us maybe too long, well into the wine hour, which I shouldn't do. But it is one of the puzzling aspects about Foucault's tremendous work on power, Macht. It is the reduction of power to habit, to habitus. What Foucault understands by disciplinarity, for example, it's as if power loses that structure of belief, that structure of justification, and I don't quite agree with that perspective. I mean, I think there is, if speaking now, as critical social theorist, there are many aspects of social life, maybe a lot, of course, that is based on habitus, that is based on just, rote and so on. But I don't think that power alone is, of course it can involve discipline, right? But even discipline itself needs to be justified. But that's a kind of, I think, a subtle, sort of a dividing line between a critical theory approach, I would say Habermas, Honneth, and Reiner Force, and a kind of more Foucauldian approach. I mean, that I don't know if I'm taking your question somewhere else. I may be, but yeah, go ahead.
No, like it was kind of in the right direction, and I appreciate your elaborations. I just wanted to go more deep into kind of the first part of the question, talking about real material circumstances, like not only the power structures that are embedded in recognition or intelligibility, but more like the capital that is a precondition, like also if we're talking about the circumstances of the world, then there are some structures that are quite evident, power structures as well, that kind of structure maybe also the concept of cosmopolitanism, and how you include that.
Yeah, okay, I understand now. Look, I think that maybe in the second lecture, what I distinguish cosmopolitanism from neoliberal globalization, I will be able to provide some answer to you. Of course, communication is embedded, very actual empirical communication is embedded in structures of power and domination and hierarchy. And in our world, many of those also have to do with capitalism and the laws of capitalism. But I do not reduce, I reject the position that identifies cosmopolitanism with capitalism, precisely because I'm trying to show that although 18th century cosmopolitanism emerged in the age of empire and in the age of colonies, there were different kinds of arguments developing at that time. There was an argument about justice. Is it right to treat each other this way? Is it right to treat the colonies this way? And there was capitalist expansion. So in that sense, 18th century, the origins of 18th century cosmopolitanism, and even before that, the extension of the discovery of the Americas, right? The extension of our picture of the world, yes, these go together, but the projects are not the same. So at least is the argument of these lectures.
Maybe one more. Thanks. I have a very particular question jumping on the last one. You called the international law weak, and you called it expressive. And that reminded me to Habermas' conception of spheres. And I thought, well, I never thought this Habermas concept to be related to a national sovereignty, a national configuration. But to come back to you, what does this mean on the international level? Does it mean it's the law sphere, the legal sphere is not well developed in the international level? And how could you relate this to philosophical concepts and also relate back to Kant?
When I put up the slide, that was a quotation from Martha Nussbaum, who says international law is expressive and its function is function of moral persuasion. It's not my view. Okay? It's not my view. And I think and I believe also, now you also mentioned Habermas, you brought Habermas in. When you use the word Sphere, wie würden Sie das auf Deutsch sagen?
Geltungssphären.
Geltungssphäre, ja.
Ja.
Ja, also können Sie die Frage für mich nochmal formulieren, weil ich will das genau verstehen.
I'm sorry. Well, first it was a remark of my own perception. I never read Habermas as related to national sovereignty and national law, but of course it is, I recognize now. And on the other hand, how can I put this back on the international level? Is there a lack of development of international law? Do we have to develop that kind of sphere? And my question was, how is this related to your concept? What kind of, I think you have thought about this. And so my question is, do you see any visions for this? And is there a relation back to Kant also?
Yes, yes. Habermas has this very important formulation in his reflections on the European Union in particular, right? And it's of course right because, you know, the project of the European Union is also the development of European law. Let's take this as an example, right? There is the European Convention on Human Rights, but there is also the European Charter of Freedom and Rights that is only applicable to members of the European Union, whereas the Convention holds for members like Russia and Turkey, etc., that are not members of the European Union. So, I mean, the whole development of a domain of a right, you know, the idea of citizens of Europe. On the other hand, also all the legislation coming out of the European Court of Human Rights in matters like asylum, for example, right? It shows us that institutionally, right, let's put it this way, institutionally the sphere of international law is much more advanced than these brief formulations in Nussbaum's work. I could give other examples as well, but what Habermas raises as a question is a question that's important, is what is the validity? What is the Geltung, right? And it's clear that the validity of law must be grounded upon the will of those who stand under the law, right? That's the whole idea of the social contract, that, you know, the law, man muss die Zustimmung geben können. Even Kant says this, right? That no law can be legitimate, that cannot be made public, to which I can give my Zustimmung. And we know he was not consistent about this, but in that brilliant essay, he also formulates this criteria. There is, in that sense, a legitimation gap in much of international law because, and I think this is part of the correct aspect of Nussbaum's critique, but unfortunately, it doesn't get elaborated that way. If there is this legitimation gap about international law in the sense that it is via conventions and treaties to which my government or my representatives have agreed that it functions, what is the gap between its validity in the eyes of the Bürger, the Zustimmung, right, there, and the I have, yes, pondered this question. My one answer that is something I call democratic iterations. And the example for me, the experience that made me think about this, and by democratic iterations is a very abstract level, I mean when, let's say, the very abstract principles formulated in something like CEDAW, right, become part of the concrete struggles of the citizens and residents of a polity, right? When these rights are not just asserted because some commission formulated them, but when citizens and movements themselves claim these rights and reinterpret them. So iteration means reinterpretation. It means reappropriation. And this happens in many domains of international law, and I think that it would be, my approach would be this more, to use the old word, the dialectical approach that closes the legitimation gap by showing also that those to whom these rights apply can also claim or make them their own. Now, my experience, I mean, I think I bring a lot of these examples out of the women's movement about, you know, I think a lot also about asylum right, but for example, a really fascinating question that's happening, that change that's happening now is when many people, young people, are going to their constitutions. This is happening not only in countries like Holland, you know, but in the state of Montana, in the United States, there is a case of various youth organizations that actually litigated against oil companies and so on, saying the Constitution gives them the right to a clean and sustainable environment. And the state court actually found this justifiable. So this is also, again, an example of a kind of interaction between international principles, constitutional principles, and, you know, people reappropriating these claims for themselves.
Perhaps two last questions. The lady back there and gentleman.
Maybe we'll take the questions together, no?
Right, yes, let's do that.
Yes, thank you. I think this actually maybe latches onto this a little bit, since you now also mentioned the word constitutions, because throughout your lecture regarding the international legal cosmopolitanism, I was wondering about how you relate this to kind of the discussions about global constitutionalism as such, and if you see kind of the legal cosmopolitanism as maybe overlapping or identical with the either, I think some people will say a project, some people will say a description of global constitutionalism.
Yeah, thank you. My question would be, you criticize the liberal, what you call the liberal nationalism, and my question is...
I criticize what?
Liberal nationalism.
Yes.
No? Yeah. And the question would be, how do you distinguish liberal nationalism from what in Habermas' theory was called, or constitutional patriotism? So, because at least what these two concepts united in a way is what Hegel called concrete universality, you know. That, yeah, that's it. So if you criticize liberal nationalism, whether you also would be critical towards constitutional patriotism, or what is the conceptual distinction between these two concepts? So that's it.
Yes, let me begin with the second question. I'll come back to the first. The two are related. In the phrase liberal nationalism, what remains undefined is the nation. And remember, Habermas introduced the term Verfassungspatriotismus in the context of a big German debate about what to expect of immigrants. And the argument was that they should acknowledge bestimmte Werte, the values. And Habermas said it suffices if they acknowledge, if they are constitutional patriots, in the sense that if they uphold the principles of the German constitution, because the term values, as you know, is a very vague term, which can be also very exclusionary. Have you realized the values? Have you not realized the values? Whereas a constitutional law has norms and structures. So the key here would be, and I will talk about this again, in the term liberal nationalism, the boundaries of the nation are not specified, they are taken for granted. And we have some terms like ethnos versus demos, right? In my understanding, demos includes members who may be those who are members of different ethnoi. A demos, it does not consist of a single ethnos. And so this is a little bit my struggle with, with liberal nationalism, but there are also some premises of theirs that I agree with, so I'm not going to completely dismiss the position. So thank you for the question. Global constitutionalism, at the moment, maybe coming more, from the US context, we are having such a hard battle keeping the Constitution, let alone international law, let alone the global constitutional aspect of it. I think that maybe global constitutionalism, I mean, it's something, of course, that many jurists are working at and so on. It may be a little too close to Kant's notion also of a Weltstaat. I like to see a more transnational project with more differences, with more maybe the negotiation of differences. So I think that for the time being, maybe we shouldn't hurry up and push that project, because it will leave many away. It will leave many aside. I mean, when I think of something like asylum, the right of asylum, and Professor Çağlar works on this. I mean, there are major countries in the world like India and China that are not, operating under the 51 Refugee Convention. So how can we talk about, global constitutionalism when one of the major, let's say, rights instruments of our world, which itself has a lot of problems, as we know, right, is not accepted by many major countries. So the question will be whether we have to proceed more regionally and transnationally and keep building alliances and also understandings across regions. Thank you.
Well, let me conclude today's event first by thanking Professor Benhabib for her wonderful talk, and all of you for contributing to the discussion. Before I somehow refer you to the reception which awaits us, let me remind you of the dates of the next two talks, namely the 11th and the 19th of October, but the talks will not take place here, but at Berggasse. And you are all welcome, of course, to sort of follow up on today's argument, and the reception sort of awaits us for a glass of wine and the opportunity to talk to Professor Benhabib. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, George.